I let my dad and his new wife stay in my house, but then his wife did this. Growing up, my relationship with my dad was always complicated. He was a man of many contradictions, charming and charismatic to the outside world, but cold and distant at home. My mom often described him as someone who struggled to connect, though I came to see it as a lack of effort rather than an inability. From an early age, I knew I wasn't his priority. My parents divorced when I was 7, and while my mom did everything she could to provide a stable and loving home, my dad's presence became increasingly sporadic. His visits were marked by tension, his promises often broken, and his love always seemed conditional. When my dad remarried, his new wife, Clara, became the center of his universe. She was younger, vibrant, and eager to create a life that didn't include the baggage of his previous marriage. Unfortunately, that baggage included me. "I don't think Clara likes kids," he said once, as if that excused his growing distance. The few times I visited their home, I felt like an outsider, a guest in a space that wasn't meant for me. Clara's polite but strained smiles only confirmed it. "Maybe it's better if we do visit somewhere neutral," my dad suggested one day. "It's just easier for everyone." I nodded, too hurt to argue. Visits became less frequent, replaced by occasional phone calls and birthday cards that arrived weeks late. Over time, I stopped expecting anything from him. By the time I graduated high school, my dad was more of a distant relative than a parent. He wasn't there for my big moments. No attendance at my graduation, no calls to congratulate me on my college acceptance. Clara's influence had all but erased me from his life, and I had learned to stop trying to fight for space in it. My mom, on the other hand, was my rock. She worked tirelessly to make sure I had what I needed, encouraging me to chase my dreams even when the odds felt stacked against us. "You're going to do great things," she told me once, her voice filled with conviction. "And you don't need anyone to believe in you but yourself." Those words became my mantra. When I left for college, I carried with me a mixture of determination and resentment. I was determined to build a life that wasn't defined by my dad's neglect or Clara's dismissiveness. But deep down, there was still a part of me that wanted him to see me, to acknowledge my worth. College was my escape, a chance to step out of the shadow of my dad's indifference and build a life on my own terms. It wasn't easy, but it was liberating. For the first time, I felt like I was in control, unshackled from the weight of trying to earn his approval. I threw myself into my studies, determined to make the most of the opportunity my mom had worked so hard to provide. Between classes, part-time jobs, and late nights at the library, I carved out a path for myself. While my dad's absence left a void, it also taught me resilience. I didn't have the luxury of a safety net, no fallback plan, no parental support to catch me if I stumbled. Every success I achieved felt like a victory earned through sheer grit. During my first year, I reached out to my dad a few times. Part of me hoped college might be a fresh start for us, a way to reconnect. But his responses were always lukewarm, his tone distant. "That's great," he said when I told him about making the dean's list. "Clara and I are proud of you." Proud. The word felt hollow coming from him, like something he thought he was supposed to say rather than something he truly felt. By my second year, I stopped trying. I didn't call, and neither did he. Clara occasionally sent me holiday cards with generic messages, but they only served as reminders of how little they knew or cared about my life. Instead, I focused on the people who truly supported me. My mom remained my biggest cheerleader, always ready with words of encouragement or a care package filled with homemade cookies. I also formed close friendships at college, finding a chosen family that valued me in ways my dad never had. By the time I graduated, I had not only earned my degree but also a sense of self-worth that wasn't tied to his validation. I landed a job in a field I was passionate about, and though it didn't pay much initially, it was a stepping stone to a brighter future. As I settled into adulthood, I began to save for something I had always dreamed of, my own home. It was a goal that symbolized more than just financial stability. It was a testament to my independence, proof that I could thrive without my dad's involvement. Years of hard work paid off, and by my late 20s, I had saved enough to put a down payment on a modest but charming house in a quiet neighborhood. The day I signed the papers, I felt a mix of pride and relief. This house was mine. Not Clara's, not my dad's, mine. For the first time in my life, I felt truly free. Life in my new home felt like a fresh start. I decorated each room to reflect my personality, filling the space with warmth and memories I was eager to create. It was modest but perfect, a haven that symbolized how far I'd come. Then, one evening, I got an unexpected call from my dad. "Hey," he began, his tone unusually hesitant. "I know it's been a while." It had been years since we'd spoken directly, and hearing his voice stirred a mix of emotions. Part of me wanted to hang up, but curiosity, and perhaps a lingering hope for reconciliation, kept me on the line. "How have you been?" I asked cautiously. He sighed. "Not great, honestly. Clara and I are going through a rough patch financially. We've had to sell the house." The words hit me harder than I expected. Despite our strained relationship, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy. "That sounds tough," I said, unsure of what else to offer. He hesitated again before continuing. "I was wondering if maybe we could stay with you for a little while, just until we get back on our feet." I was stunned. For years, my dad and Clara had made me feel like an afterthought, and now they wanted my help? "I don't know," I said, my voice cautious. "I'd have to think about it." "Of course," he said quickly. "Take your time. But we'd really appreciate it." Over the next few days, I wrestled with the decision. On one hand, I had worked hard to create a life free of their influence, and the thought of them invading my space was unsettling. On the other hand, this was a chance to be the bigger person, to prove that I could rise above the resentment that had defined our relationship. In the end, I said yes. "I'll help you out," I told my dad when I called him back. "But it's temporary, just until you get back on your feet." "Thank you," he said, relief evident in his voice. When they arrived, I did my best to make them feel welcome. I cleared out the guest room, stocked the fridge, and tried to keep the atmosphere light. For the first few weeks, things were surprisingly pleasant. My dad seemed genuinely grateful, and Clara kept to herself, offering to cook dinner or tidy up occasionally. But it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Clara's helpfulness quickly turned into unsolicited criticism. "You should rearrange the living room," she suggested one afternoon, moving furniture without asking. "It'd look much better this way." She also had a habit of commenting on my spending. "Do you really need all these streaming subscriptions?" she asked once, scrolling through my TV menu. "You could save so much money if you cut back." My dad, meanwhile, started acting as though the house were his. He'd invite his friends over without warning, turning the living room into a loud, boisterous hangout spot. When I tried to set boundaries, he brushed me off. "Relax," he said. "We're family." The final straw came one evening when Clara casually mentioned the possibility of renting out one of my spare rooms. "You could make some good money," she said, smiling. "And it's not like you're using the space." "That's not happening," I replied firmly. She frowned. "Why not? You'd barely notice the difference." "Because this is my house," I said, my frustration boiling over. "And I'm not turning it into a boarding house just because you think it's a good idea." The tension in the room was palpable, but I didn't back down. That night, as I lay in bed, I realized I had made a mistake. Inviting them into my home hadn't brought us closer. It had only reminded me of why I distanced myself in the first place. The unease in my home grew with every passing day. What had started as an act of kindness was quickly turning into a nightmare. Clara's subtle critiques and my dad's dismissive attitude made it clear they didn't respect the boundaries I had set. Then came the rent demand, a moment that shattered any illusions I had about their gratitude. One evening, as we sat down for dinner, Clara casually mentioned an idea she and my dad had been thinking about. "We've been discussing the living arrangements," she began, her tone carefully neutral. I looked up from my plate, immediately wary. "What about them?" "Well," she said, glancing at my dad for support, "it seems only fair that since we're staying here, we should be able to have a say in how things are managed. After all, we're contributing to the household." I raised an eyebrow. "Contributing how?" She smiled faintly. "By helping out with chores, groceries, things like that. And we were thinking it might be a good idea if you started paying us rent." I froze. unsure if I had heard her correctly. Excuse me? We're helping you maintain this house, my dad chimed in, his tone serious. And since we're family, we thought this arrangement could work for all of us. For a moment, I was too stunned to respond. You want me to pay you rent, I said slowly, to live in my own house? Clara nodded, her expression calm. It's not unreasonable. We're all benefiting from this living situation, and it's only fair to share the load. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Fair. I repeated, my voice rising. You don't pay anything to live here. I cover the mortgage, the bills, the groceries, everything, and now you want me to pay you. My dad leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. We're just trying to make things equitable, he said. Equitable? I said, laughing bitterly. This isn't about equity. This is about you two trying to take advantage of me. I opened my home to you because you said you needed help. And this is how you repay me? Clara bristled at my tone. There's no need to get defensive, she said. We're just trying to contribute in a way that makes sense. No, I said firmly, standing up. You're trying to manipulate me into giving you money. And it's not going to happen. The room fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. You're overreacting, my dad said finally. No, I replied, meeting his gaze. I'm setting boundaries. If you can't respect that, then maybe it's time for you to find somewhere else to stay. My dad's expression darkened. Is that what you want? He asked. What I want, I said, my voice steady, is to feel like my home is my own again. If you can't give me that, then yes, it's time for you to leave. Clara muttered something under her breath, but I didn't care. I was done letting them dictate the terms of my life. That night, I drafted a formal letter outlining a 30-day notice for them to vacate the house. It was a difficult decision, but one that felt necessary for my own sanity. When I handed it to my dad the next morning, he barely looked at it before tossing it onto the table. Fine, he said, his tone icy. We'll go. Clara, however, wasn't as composed. You're making a big mistake, she snapped. Don't expect us to help you when things fall apart. Her words stung, but I stood my ground. I've been fine without your help before, I said, and I'll be fine now. Watching them pack up their belongings over the next few weeks was both heartbreaking and liberating. It wasn't just about reclaiming my space. It was about reclaiming my peace of mind. When the day finally came for my dad and Clara to leave, I felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Watching them load their belongings into their car was a stark reminder of how much our relationship had fractured. Despite everything, part of me had hoped this experience might bring us closer, but it had done the opposite. Clara barely spoke to me as she carried out the last of their boxes. Her icy glares and clipped responses made it clear she was leaving on bad terms. My dad, though less outwardly hostile, maintained a stony silence that hurt more than I cared to admit. Take care, I said as they got into the car. My dad nodded but didn't respond. Clara didn't even look back. As their car disappeared down the street, the weight of the past few months seemed to lift. For the first time in what felt like forever, my house was quiet. My space was truly mine again. But the relief was short-lived. The days following their departure were filled with a strange emptiness. While I was glad to have my home back, I couldn't help but dwell on the emotional toll of the situation. The arguments, the accusations, and the blatant disregard for my boundaries replayed in my mind like a broken record. The hardest part was coming to terms with the fact that my dad had chosen Clara's interests over mine. Time and again, he had prioritized her comfort and opinions, even when it came at my expense. It wasn't just disappointing, it was heartbreaking. One evening, as I sat on the couch sipping tea, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Day. Hey, just checking in. How are you holding up? Day had been a quiet but constant source of support throughout the ordeal. Unlike most of my extended family, they had seen through Clara's manipulations and understood the strain it had placed on me. Better now that they're gone, I replied. But it's been tough. I get it, Day wrote back. You did what you had to do. Don't let them make you feel guilty for protecting your peace. Their words stuck with me. For so long, I had let guilt dictate my actions, bending over backward to accommodate people who showed little regard for my well-being. But this time, I had chosen to put myself first, and that was something to be proud of. In the weeks that followed, I focused on reclaiming my space and my peace. I rearranged the furniture Clara had moved without asking, deep cleaned the house, and even repainted the guest room to erase the lingering memories of their stay. I also leaned heavily on my support system, spending more time with friends and family members who truly cared about me. Day and I met up often, their empathetic ear and unwavering encouragement helping me process the emotions I had been holding in. "You're stronger than you think," Day said one afternoon as we sat at a cafe. "What you did, standing up for yourself and setting boundaries, that takes courage. Not everyone can do that." Their words meant more than they knew. As I settled back into my routine, I began to see the situation not as a failure, but as a lesson. It had taught me the importance of boundaries, the value of self-respect, and the necessity of letting go of relationships that no longer serve me. My dad and Clara didn't reach out after they left, and I didn't try to contact them either. The silence between us was painful, but it also felt necessary. I needed time to heal, to rebuild, and to focus on the life I was creating for myself. With my dad and Clara gone, life slowly began to settle back into a sense of normalcy. My house, once filled with tension and conflict, returned to being the sanctuary I had worked so hard to create. The quiet was comforting, a reminder that I was finally in control of my space and my life. But the emotional scars they left behind didn't fade as quickly. There were moments when I felt a pang of guilt for asking them to leave, wondering if I'd been too harsh. Other times, I felt anger at their entitlement, their manipulation, and my dad's inability to see how much he had hurt me by prioritizing Clara over our relationship. In those moments, I leaned on the lessons I'd learned throughout this experience. Day's words echoed in my mind. "You did what you had to do. Don't let them make you feel guilty for protecting your peace." Gradually, I began to let go of the guilt. I reminded myself that setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was necessary. My dad and Clara had taken advantage of my kindness, and it was their choices, not mine, that had led to the confrontation. To help myself heal, I focused on rebuilding the parts of my life that had been overshadowed by their stay. I took on a new project at work, immersing myself in something challenging and fulfilling. The satisfaction of hitting milestones and earning recognition reminded me of my capabilities, of the strength I had developed through years of independence. I also reconnected with old hobbies that had fallen by the wayside. Painting, something I hadn't done since college, became a form of therapy. I spent hours in the guest room, now transformed into a cozy studio, letting the colors on the canvas reflect the emotions I couldn't put into words. Socially, I made a conscious effort to surround myself with people who truly valued me. Friends who celebrated my successes, listened to my struggles, and never made me feel like an afterthought. They became a constant presence, their unwavering support helping me navigate the ups and downs of this chapter. One evening, as we sat on my porch watching the sunset, Day turned to me and said, "You know, you've come a long way. You're stronger now than you've ever been." I smiled, their words sinking in. For so long, I had felt like I was fighting to prove my worth, to my dad, to Clara, even to myself. But now, I realized I didn't need their validation. My worth wasn't determined by how others treated me. It was something I carried within myself. As weeks turned into months, I found myself thinking less and less about my dad and Clara. They hadn't reached out since leaving, and while a part of me wished things could have been different, I knew I couldn't change them. Instead, I chose to focus on the relationships that mattered. My mom, who had always been my rock, became an even bigger part of my life. We spent more time together, sharing stories and laughter that reminded me of the love and stability she had always provided. Looking back on everything, I realized the experience with my dad and Clara had been a turning point. It forced me to confront the patterns of my past, to stand up for myself in ways I never had before, and to prioritize my own well-being above all else. To anyone who has ever felt taken for granted or overshadowed, I want to say this. You don't have to tolerate disrespect or sacrifice your peace for the sake of others. It's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to choose yourself. Today, my life feels fuller than ever. My home is a reflection of the life I've built, a life defined by resilience, self-respect, and the unwavering belief that I deserve peace and happiness. Here's to moving forward, one step at a time, with strength, clarity, and hope for the future.